Hello, International Master David Proust here with the fourth video in the Attacking and Chess Reserved series. We've now learned from the previous videos what the concept of reserves is and how they count both for the attacker and the defender. And the traditional way, or one of the traditional ways of knowing whether an attack will succeed or fail, is to count the number of attackers versus the number of defenders. And if you're outnumbering the defender, there's a good chance you'll succeed, and if the defender outnumbers you, there's a good chance that you won't succeed if you attack them. And so what we're talking about here is the ability to count the pieces which aren't yet in the attack or defense but have the potential to get there in one or two moves, to count those extra pieces and how fast they can get there and see, you know, who's going to have more attackers or defenders in 2 moves or in 5 moves down the road because of that. Today we're going to see a couple examples of some more long-term counting of attackers versus defenders because of sort of more distant reserves or longer-term use of reserves. So it'll be a little bit of a different thing. I'm going to start with 2 small snippets, and then I'm going to show you a sample game. So go here. Wait, I need to also get this window. All right. So is this working? Yes, I think so. You guys see the screen. So in this position here, there's a very typical attacking operation which is sometimes used in these scenarios. When there's a pawn on h6, you can use that as a hook to sort of break apart the pawn cover on the black king with the following bishop for 2 pawn sacrifice. And a bishop for 2 pawns is not a huge sacrifice. So it's something that you'll see people sometimes do where they only get a little bit of compensation. They only need a pawn or so of compensation to make that a fine trade. One of the main ideas behind this, if you look at it, is that it's going to be hard for black to bring reserves in. And let me show you that white's attackers currently number queen and bishop 2, and black's defenders currently number knight and the king himself. So white has an advantage in terms of attackers, but 2 pieces can't give checkmate against 1 typically. So the point is that white's going to bring in reserves. And even more importantly than that is that it's often really hard for black to bring reserves over to help the king. And that is because of the freeze on these 2 squares. So if this knight moves somewhere, white's able to give checkmate. That is the case no matter where the knight moves, with the small exception of here, which is a defensive move that you always have to consider as white. Here, you can recover the piece you sacrificed while bringing this knight from c3 to e4 and towards the king side. But very often this knight will essentially be frozen here because of the checkmate threat on h7 and because e4 will be controlled by white. If this knight is frozen, then you obviously know that based on the rules of chess, this pawn is frozen too. Well, if those 2 things are frozen, it can become very difficult for black to transfer any pieces from other parts of the board to the king side, which means white can get sort of like a slow motion winning attack. Now I'm just going to cover 1 or 2 more points here. One is that in this particular case, white actually has a pretty fast way to bring an extra reserve into the game, and that's the knight on g5. And that'll often win the game very quickly by threatening bishop h7, so that when the knight takes, the queen can take back. That can be a very powerful extra threat. So for example, in this position, black actually does have a way to bring a reserve to defend the king, which is this bishop. So he's got, basically because these 2 are frozen, he's got 1 single square through which to try and pivot as many defenders as possible. And it doesn't work out here because white's knight comes into play so quickly. And for example, you get this kind of checkmate. And that's because white had a quick reserve. But let's show another scenario where white's reserves aren't as quick. I'm going to take this piece off the board and put this piece here. So same bishop takes h6, sacrifice, and the queen here. And now in this situation, the rook can't move because of this knight. And this knight can't move. Oh, sorry, it's black's move. This knight can't move because it's supporting this knight. So here we have a complete freeze of the black pieces, and so white could win this with very, very leisurely moves. I mean, if I do something silly, like put my bishop... Oh, I can't put my bishop because I need it for this. Alright, so I'm going to put my knight here. I could conceivably, as white, win a position like this by sort of moving my knight, then my rook, and finally bringing the rook to one of these squares to threaten some checkmates. You could really go like very, very, very slow motion and win a position like this as white because of the complete freeze, keeping black from bringing reserves. So you can actually bring in reserves that are like 3 moves away instead of 1 move away, effectively. But while we're in this position, I can't resist just asking you guys if you see the fastest way for white to win this game. The fastest way to bring reserves for white would be this maneuver. Just want you guys to know about it. Threatens rook g3, and then when they take it, you take back with this pawn, and you get rook g1. And black is defeated after some number of moves, kind of like this, for example. Just a cool use of those pieces. So, very important concept is having some pieces that are stuck or frozen that block lines of communication. Without lines of communication, you can't use reserves. So one last thing before we go on to today's game is this fairly random position here just to illustrate an idea. You can use a strategy of purposely freezing something of your opponent's to block the lines of communication in their camp, and then it'll be hard for them to transfer pieces, and you can use that later as your justification for an attack almost anywhere. So watch this. e6, pawn sacrifice, and when black takes, white is now going to control the e5 square. And there's a number of ways to do it. You can play f4, you can play knight f3. If you play f4, you give them a chance to sack back the pawn, but this is also good for white to have these f-pawns traded. But let's say somehow black gave you time to put your knight here. You've now frozen these 2 pawns, which means you've limited the lines of communication between the queen side and the king side to a single square, e8. And the overall strategy here can be that whether black's king goes to the queen side or the king side, you'll eventually be able to start an attack on whichever side of the board he goes to. And because of the blocked lines of communication, he won't be able to bring reserves to whichever side that happens to be. So this is a deliberate strategy of breaking your opponent's lines of communication so that they won't have reserves, and you can use that as the basis for an attack later. Just a good technique to know that I wanted to slip in while we're on the topic of reserves. That often these kind of attacks, they don't just come out of nowhere. You actually set them up by deliberately creating a situation where you can bring in reserves and your opponent can't. And our example game for today is a little bit in this vein as well. Alright, so we'll start here. White has a space advantage in the center out of a pretty aggressive opening, the Austrian attack. In this position, black has been trying to put pressure on e5 and force white to trade, but they're finding themselves unable to for tactical reasons, such as just one example to show you why black sort of gives up on it here. Don't worry if these moves don't look exactly right to you, because they're not necessarily totally precise, but this should lead to, this is just one example of the kind of thing that black's having problems with trying to trade on e5. The problem is knight f7 here can't really be stopped because of this. There's even a secondary threat of queen f7, which is equally devastating, pretty much. So just an example of how black, since they're slightly behind in sort of aggressive power of their pieces right now. They're not in a great position to open the board, and so finally they give up on taking on e5, and they just play f5, sort of closing the position. So white transfers a knight towards the king side, and this is the beginning of where we would start thinking about whether or not white's going to be able to attack the black king. Black needs to take pretty quick action because white actually has a pretty strong attacking plan available already, which is queen e1, queen h4. And once the queen gets to h4, basically black's going to be under a lot of pressure trying to defend this pawn. So let me play a neutral move for black, just in case anyone doesn't realize this. Once I get to h4, too late to take this. So now if you ever want to get this knight out of your face, you have to move your king this way, which lines up with this one here. But even here, there's not really a threat to take on g5, because if I go la 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 la, and you go here and I go here, you can't keep the queen out of h7, and so something bad is going to still happen to black here very quickly. So to some extent, once white gets to the queen to h4, this knight is kind of locked in, and it's hard for black to contest any of these squares and kick the white pieces out. And white can look for the right chance to sort of maybe move the knight to h3 and take on h6, or crank up the pressure with g4, or play some sort of like knight sack followed by bishop h6. Basically, it's very problematic for black to get into a situation where white has this many extra pieces on the king side compared to him in terms of power. So in the game, what black does is immediately try to chase away the knight. And the notion is that if you retreat your knight, black's able to gain a lot of space on the king side, keep white's pieces out, threatening g4. Let's say we save our knight, and black. A difficult choice for black at all points in the game we're going to see is whether to play bishop e6 to develop the bishop, or e6 to gain a little bit more space for like the queen and the knights. But let's just say that here, after bishop e6, black's not in immediate danger of getting attacked on the king side because he actually has a bit of space there, and some lines of communication for his own pieces because of that extra space. So, question for white. Does white have enough extra pieces on the king side to execute a winning attack by sacrificing this knight? By leaving it here to prevent black's expansion? Or, could we just take here in that variation that we just showed with g5? In which case, black would probably play e6 first and then go for g5 a little bit later, and then do we have anything special? So it's a key moment for white to calculate a few variations here. And in my opinion, it's really hard to try to brute force this and decide it by a calculation. So if I give you a variation to start calculating, queen to e1, pawn takes knight, knight takes pawn. The threat is queen h4 check, followed by checkmate on h7. Okay, so queen e1, pawn takes knight, knight takes pawn. Black, to stop that checkmate, can play bishop h6. Then when you play queen h4, he can play king g7, defending the bishop on h6, and thus keeping your queen out of h7 for the moment. He also has the rook f8 to h8 possibility at that point because his king's off the back rank. So if I ask you to tell me if that is good or bad for white, queen h4, king g7, can you tell me by calculation? Can you tell if that's a winning or losing or drawing position for white? Yeah, I'd be surprised if many of the people watching feel like, oh yeah, you could just brute force calculate that and figure out if that attack wins or loses. To me, it's a good example of a situation where you basically have to ask yourself, do I have enough, attackers or defenders compared to black? And even there, the answer is not super obvious. Sorry, my computer just beeped. Let me make sure that everything's still working. Yeah, it looks all right. even then it's not super obvious. And to me, you have to introduce the notion of reserves as well. And you have to see that white's attack is maybe at a partial. We have one viewer saying that he thinks that it's actually. I don't know why this is beeping all the time right now. That's annoying. Sorry about that. We have one viewer saying that he thinks that attack is bad for white. I definitely think it's like a close call and that you have to consider what kind of reserves white or black are going to be able to bring in to further add to that attack. I also want to mention for anyone who cares that in this position white has a second very strong move, knight h4, which is also kind of tricky to calculate, but basically it's pretty good because this square can't be defended. If queen e8, you have bishop takes d5, pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn, and you're just up a pawn, right? So he kind of has to go for this. This one's not a very big sacrifice, right? Because, well, it's not even a sacrifice because you get this, and then you get this. And you don't have an immediate attack, but you've basically just made a trade of your two knights for his two kingside pawns and his kingside rook. And again, it's kind of a situation of reserves, where white's going to be able to bring in more reserves faster than black. You've got queen h5 coming, you've got g4, you've got an open line of communication for the a1 rook. And black just doesn't have nearly as fast a way to bring those four pieces into action on the king side. So if you look at the current attackers, well, white has maybe two, and black has maybe like two defenders. Obviously, a rook is more powerful than a pawn, but it's a little bit supported. So white doesn't. I mean, a rook and a bishop couldn't checkmate a king even if black had no defenders. So it's not like white has a raging attack here at all. It may not even look like he has a threat yet at the moment, but he actually has a winning situation because of his ability to bring in reserves. There's absolutely no way that black's going to counter a queen here and using the g-pawn maybe and using this rook. And I'm not even going to show any variations. I'm just going to tell you that this would have been a pretty much winning option for white. And we're going to go back to the more complicated option, which I actually played in this position as a teenager in a tournament. So I didn't even consider that knight h4 idea because, like most chess players, I have a certain amount of tunnel vision. Like, you're looking at a certain idea, you keep looking at it. So I was tunneled on this kind of idea, and I was just looking at it, trying to see if I could make it work, and trying to look pretty deeply, but obviously not being able to see everything, and finally deciding it was good, and so I never really considered knight h4. So let's see how good it actually is. I play queen e1, takes, knight takes. Uh-oh, we lost our variation. Let's go over here just so we don't lose the variation. Black has to play bishop h6. Like I said, this is what we showed you up to here. All right, and in this situation, white has a queen and knight attacking. Black has a bishop and pawn defending, and a rook, which is an obvious reserve, I would say, since it can easily get into the defense and is kind of bolstering this pawn. White also has a pretty obvious reserve, which is the bishop on c1. So the first variation that I had calculated before going queen e1 was to play something like knight e6, bringing in this reserve. Unfortunately, we have to sack one whole piece to bring in one whole piece. So it doesn't actually increase the number of pieces we have attacking, right? So let's have a quick look at what this gives. Queen check, king here, queen check, king here, queen check, and you see that black escapes. And actually, I forget if his best move is bishop f7 or king d7 now. Like, bishop f7 looks decent as well because you can play this move. Now your bishop's on this side of the board. On the other hand, it gives up a third pawn, so white still probably has fair chances, right, with 3 pawns against a knight. Other option is king to d7. And if white wants a third pawn, no, this fails. Bishop d5 fails. It's just investing too much in trying to get pawns and leaving white with not many pieces and black with a counterattack. But in any case, okay, so in any case, we shouldn't win back the third pawn. But in any case, even here it looks like it's kind of a close situation, right? White has two pawns against the knight, and black's position has some awkwardness. So the other option is to take with the bishop. King here, take. Now we've sacked less material, right? Because he gets to bring this piece back. But again, if you look at this position, it's not like that obviously good for white. Like all these pieces came out. Next move, queen g7. Every black piece plays in the game. The material balance right now is a pawn and a rook against two knights, which is a slight disadvantage for white. So it's complicated, but again, it's not quite good enough. So knight e6 probably leads to like a slight advantage for black, but a complicated position. But when I calculated those variations before playing queen e1, I didn't find them that discouraging because to me they showed that white was close to being able to just play the direct method of just trading his knight for his own bishop. I see this almost as trading your knight for your bishop, right? But if we look at attackers right now, queen and knight versus bishop and pawn, now come here, 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 we could have queen and bishop versus king. You could sometimes increase the count of attackers versus defenders even though you're sacking this if you're bringing in a new reserve and not bringing in a new reserve for the opponent. Problem is there's just no real way to continue the attack from here other than to trade off their rook, and then you're not really attacking. So anyway, the point I wanted to make is even though the variations show that they don't quite work for white, I actually found them a little bit encouraging because knight e6 is not like an optimal use of your knight, and yet it was so close to working. And that, to me, indicated that white was close to having enough for the attack here. Does that make sense? Like, often you can build up before you play a move like knight e6, or get your opponent to play e6 first and get one extra pawn for it, and that one pawn could be the difference since we're talking about situations that are pretty close on material, very, very small material sacrifices by white. So this is, the brute force direct method. It doesn't quite work, but it's close to working, and that was actually encouraging to me. And before going for this whole sack, I'd seen a nice follow-up move, which is g4. And this is an example of using reserves because we're bringing the pawn and the rook sort of to bear on the fight a little bit more. Now, it might also bring out black's bishop and rook, so you have to be careful when you play this kind of move. It can be a little bit tricky. But this seems like a good moment to tell you what the overall reason why this could work for white is. The overall reason it could work for white is that black has actually like a little narrow area of a very narrow area to move his pieces through, right? So he does have lines of communication from the queen side to the king side, but it's fairly narrow, whereas white has lots of space to bring his rook and his bishop. So the general idea of this entire attack for white, the general positional basis or justification, is that it's going to be harder for black to bring these three pieces to the king side than it is for white to bring these two. This knight is black's extra piece, kind of, since we've sacked a knight. The rook and bishop are pretty symmetrical to white's rook and bishop. And the overall reason this is that I thought that this should work for white was based on the notion that I'd be able to bring in these reserves while black wouldn't be able to bring in those reserves as quickly. So when I made the evaluation to go for this, it wasn't really based on a calculation. It wasn't even based on like, oh, I've got two attackers versus one defender that's not as strong as them. It was based on adding the reserve count to the whole thing. So now let's see how it works out. G4. Well, the first thing is, what's the point of this move? Well, the point of this move is that having a pawn on g4 improves those knight e6 variations. So we actually now kind of threaten knight e6, which I will just quickly prove here, like this. I'm not really proving it right. This is the wrong variation because I'm hanging my queen. Hang on 1 second. Sorry about that. Check. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Let's try this one. This one. Take here. And now in this variation, if he covers with the queen, you can take, and nab this. And if he takes back, you have rook f5 check. That's the extra power at the end of the variation. And if he gives a queen check, you can bring this back and cover yourself. And now white has a rook and pawn against a single knight instead of 2 knights, so should be pretty crushing for white. If black takes with the king instead of with the queen, then he doesn't have the queen on this side as a reserve defender. And white has a number of strong continuations here, I imagine, between queen here, maybe just queen here. Materially, white's already in good shape with so many extra pawns, and he's also threatening this, and black's also still disorganized. Okay. So basically G4, with the power to possibly open the rook on the f-file, we're now threatening some version of knight e6. And actually, it may even be stronger to take on f5 first and then play knight e6 check after a6. I don't even remember that for sure. It may or may not make a difference. Well, it actually can't hurt white, really. Yeah. So anyway, so that's the power that this brings and the threat. So now we also have to quickly ask ourselves if black can't just take the pawn and let these pieces out and play bishop f5, and the answer is he can't, because once he opens this file, the king's cut off. And so white can just sort of rampage around here, take this, do whatever he wants, maybe even find a quick checkmate. So black can't take on g4, and white's threatening to take on f5 and come in here. If black plays e6, then this is another example of white's able to get one more pawn with the sacrifice, right? And it's going to be hard for black to stem the tide of pawns. Or it should be. Number of possibilities. Maybe bring in another reserve. Now, there's a few things that can happen from here. Generally speaking, white's already caught up on material. Probably get 4 pawns for the piece by now, or could try and go for something like this check to keep the king from escaping, and then go for rook to g1. Oh, you also have queen g6 because the queen can't block because of that. And then you could go for something like this. And you also have bishop d5, bishop f6 as an option. So, a number of ways for white to probably win that situation. So in any case, black doesn't take on e6, but takes on g5. There it is. Queen takes g5. All right. So now the threat would still be check, check, take this, and then play g takes f5. That is still the threat. So if black plays e6 to get more room for the queen and knight to defend, but block out the bishop for the moment. Check here, And now, 1 second. Check here, check here. One option, something like this. Black can't take on f5 either way because of the knight on d5. And white gets in f6 next, if black doesn't. I don't know, a few different things are possible. This move might also be good, actually, taking here first. So if they take here, now you can check, and here, check. And if they come here, the knight's hanging, which covers g8. And if they come here, you have this. And if they come here, you have this. So this finally becomes a reserve. And if they take this way, now we can again cut the king off from escaping with this check. Oh, bishop g5, there's rook g8, so we should play this check first. Can't come this way because of bishop g5. Has to come this way. And I don't know if this is better or worse than rook f3 or rook f2, but it looks pretty effective. And actually, we also have bishop h6 check, so maybe you should have gone here. Yeah, that's always better because you can actually get your rook in front of your king that way as well. But let's just see some more reserves coming in for white. Wee-hee! And once again, black's bishop and rook are underperforming compared to white's bishop and rook. So in the game, what if 19 gf5? Yes, that is what I just showed. There must be a slight lag on the video, maybe? On the live stream. Okay, so in the game, black plays f4. And this move is designed to keep white from opening the f-file to trap the king and to block out this bishop so that white can't get queen h6 played. And black is giving white an option of trading, and getting out this piece. Winning, a second pawn, and renewing threats around queen h6. But it also does get black a little bit more space for these pieces. So, I don't know. It's possible. I mean, seems like there's a pretty strong threat coming from queen h6 as well here. I'm not sure exactly what the defense is. I mean, one option is definitely to sack and exchange here to bring all the pieces out. Like rook f4, bishop e6. Black gets every piece out, and they're not losing yet, but white still has some chances to, play h5 or something with this. It looks close. Another option for black might actually be rook h8 to prevent queen h6 check. Even though it gets off the f-file, that might actually be good enough. I guess this might be our try here. But if h4, then this cool defensive move ruins white's party. Howdy, Chess King, and welcome to the broadcast. So actually, this might be a slick defensive move, stopping Queen H6 for the moment and giving Black time for Bishop E6 and Rook A to finally come in. So in general, the problem with doing this is that we are making it a lot easier for Black to bring out these two pieces. Because the real problem for Black is that he can use E6 for either a pawn or a bishop. If he uses it for the bishop, his queen doesn't have room to get out of the way of the rook. And if he uses it for a pawn, then his bishop's in the way of the rook. So in this position, there's something stronger than taking on F4, which is I now played Bishop D3, so fairly direct threat here. And there's only one good way to defend that square, and it's queen here. So now we've dealt with the possibility of Black playing E6 and trading our queen, which is Black's sort of quasi-threat in this position, is that now that the bishop's locked out and you can't get to H6, next move he could play E6 and trap your queen into a queen trade. So that prevents it, refocusing the bishop onto here from this. And now White brings in more reserves. Again, Bishop F4 looks sort of possible. Knight takes, rook takes, queen takes. It does win us a second pawn, which again is another sign that we're not losing too badly, because we have two pawns against the knight. But it also does give Black time to, bring out his pieces and defend, right? Queen here or bishop here, either way. White doesn't have a clear supremacy in attacking pieces anymore. So stronger than that is White brings a new reserve, the H-pawn. And now there's a fairly direct threat to this little pawn, which is he'll come to H5 and then you'll play bishop takes G6. Black actually doesn't have any great pieces ready to deal with this square or to chase away White's queen, which are the two things he'd like to do. If he plays bishop here, H5, bishop here, he defends G6, but he blocks in this rook, which allows White to bring in more reserves without trading them, right? With the second rook coming over. And this looks very strong to me. Another option might be E6, trading off this pawn for this move. But I never calculated this before, so let me quickly check if this is a good or a bad idea. It looks like a plausible idea. If queen d7, you can check here. And if queen d8, you can check here and take this. So the queen pretty much has to go to c8. And even then, this move will work. Because wherever the king goes, well, there's either mate in 1 or there's going here and then check and mate. Wherever he goes, he gets mated quickly. So yeah, so actually the move E6 would thwart this attempt to use this piece. Black's cramp doesn't allow him to get good use out of it. So after H4, Black plays E6 in order to answer H5 with a knight coming to E7. And there's finally a way to use this reserve defender. But that's what White was waiting for partly, was for Black to shut out this bishop from coming to E6 and attacking G4, etc. And now White actually makes this trade. And this is again done because White sees that he can bring this piece out faster than this piece and or this piece. So queen h6 is threatened. Not a lot of great things to do about it. Black could just keep moving this piece to defend it, but he's letting White get further ahead in terms of White's attackers. And White can play h6. Knight back to e7. It has to be that knight so that we don't allow queen f6 by accident. don't know, I'm tempted to play bishop g3, bishop h4 here, but or c4 to get into f6. Maybe force black to make the trade now. That could even be done without the move h5. You can also consider it here. So in the game, black just trades it off, trade, trade, trade. So still, white has queen and bishop attacking versus queen, but don't forget that these pawns have been brought in to help a lot, right? White has had time to play g4 and h4. Advancing those pawns closer to black, they help him to try and break things open. And now this rook is also one move away from coming out, whereas this move, check, here, here, seems pretty strong. Actually, I can also use the move of the king, right, to play rook h1. That's a pretty good use of that rook at the risk of trading queens. Gotta do this first. Check, here, here. And now if they trade queens, I can at least win that knight back with a 2-pawn up endgame. Pretty easy. So we can see that black's not getting these pieces in time to defend against queen f6, h5, and then the rook swinging over. The game ends with black playing queen e7, threatening queen takes h4 and stopping queen f6, but white has this move, queen e4, and this forces the queen back to defend g6. If queen f7, you have rook f1, and if queen h4, you have queen check, king f8, rook f1 with checkmate, or king g8, and the reserve comes in once again. This game was played when I was maybe like 18, just between like high school and college, first year of college. So he can't take on h4 after queen e4, so he plays queen e8 defending this, and now the reserve comes, and this part is all fun once every piece gets to come into the game, right? Black can only do what they can at this point. Rook here, threatening to take this, knight here. Told you this guy would pull his weight. Another reserve comes in, and here we can see that black is just completely outnumbered in terms of attackers, right? 3 pawns, a rook, a queen, and a bishop versus a knight, a queen, a pawn, and a king. And bishop c6, queen f4. This was the final detail, and black resigned here because they realized that on knight d5 winning the rook, they would still lose to this pawn taking the place of the rook. So, and if they don't do anything, white has enough attackers to just take on g6, right? Bishop takes, knight takes, rook takes, and then queen h6 mate is a threat. And if pawn takes, then you still win with queen h6. Yeah, I do look kind of young. So final fun variation would be the final reserves are the pawns. Well, black takes the rook because otherwise the rook comes here, right? Here, if the king comes here, then this is checkmate. So the king can come here and delay the game by a move or two, and then die under an avalanche of pawns. And we can see that these 2 pawns are a lot stronger than the rook on a8 here, and that white will win in a moment. f7's threatened, for example, this, threatening checkmates. It's over. So, to me, this is like a really nice example of the role of reserves in a chess attack. And this position here is a very instructive one, also for the knight h4 variation, right, which we saw, where in this position here, white has basically no threat and no attacker, but a winning attack because of the possibility to bring in these reserves, while black is just tangled up and can't use these pieces. Or the game continuation, queen e1, which sacks the knight, based on seeing that in this situation, the problem for black between using e6 and e7 to try and find space for his queen and his bishop to move up and coordinate his pieces, that black simply won't be able to get his reserves into play as well as white's. And white is able to get the bishop and rook into play faster than black, partly because white also sees the potential of these two pawns and makes great use of every possible reserve. The g pawn, and then the h pawn threatening h5 to get black to play e6 for knight e7. Now we trade here, now that the bishop's cut off. Trade everything. We're just trading. And ultimately we're bringing in more pieces than the defender can. And the h pawn has its say. And even the e pawn can have its say. And the heroic reserves win the day. So I think it's a good game to play over a couple times for anyone who wants to really try to deepen their understanding of reserves in chess. Just play through it a couple times and see how white's able to bring in more pieces than black. I know a lot of the variations are complicated, and I urge you not to get too distracted by that, and instead focus on like the count of attackers versus defenders and see how that sort of fluctuates, and also keep your eye on the lines of communication and just the options for bringing in reserve attackers and reserve defenders. And in that case, you see that white's able to continually bring in more attackers than black can actually bring in defenders. The other thing that you see in that game is an interesting use of reserves, which is actually trading in order to win the attack. Now, in a lot of cases, the attacker doesn't want to trade. Like at some point in that game, I made mention to you that black had a certain move which would force a queen trade, which would get black, which would be very desirable for black. Without the queens at that point, it would have been hard for white to attack strongly enough to compensate for the sacrificed knight. But in this game, we see white willing to trade a bunch of pieces, right? Well, part of the reason he didn't want to trade black's queen is that for a long time, black's queen is in the way of his other pieces, and it's not really a good defender. It's like a reserve defender that's having trouble finding its post, and black has to choose if they're bringing their queen or their bishop or their knight. Whereas white's queen is an attacker. So you don't want to trade your attacker for their possible reserve. But when white is able to trade his attackers for black's defenders, like his bishop for black's knight, his rook for black's rook, in that case, actually, he traded his rook for black's rook because he was able to bring in his own extra rook as a reserve. So within a moment, he had an extra rook in the attack compared to black. And the bishop he traded for black's knight was a reserve bishop, which was also clearing the way for the rook on a1. So very often the way you'll win when you have reserves available, I mean, the obvious way is you just bring them all over there and then you checkmate the opponent when you've got 7 more pieces than them. And that we saw in some of those first examples before I showed the game. Just white bringing every piece over. But another way you sometimes do it is you actually make trades, because those trades are like the fastest way to bring your new piece in. Actually, let's share screen again for 1 second. I'll show you another classic example of this that just occurred to me. All right, new game, analysis, start the game. This is the most famous game in all of chess. This Morphy game. I'm going to try and go fast to get to the point where Morphy starts bringing in reserves. Just one simple move I want to show you is this. In this position, white's reserve can get into the game faster than any of black's reserves. So white trades an attacker for a defender in order to bring in the reserve faster. See? Trade, trade, and he replaces the attacker with the reserve. So that is the reason why you often see people trading when they have extra reserve attackers, is because often that's the way to bring in the next piece the fastest. Is like your attacker gets out of the way of your reserve so you can bring your reserve in faster, and the way the attacker does that is by trading off a defender. Then you bring in the reserve and you effectively have one extra piece attacking compared to defenders than you did the move before. So if you had 3 attackers and 2 defenders, you trade an attacker for a defender, it's like 2 to 1, but it allows you with tempo to bring in your next reserve. Now it's 3 to 1. And so your attacker to defender ratio goes from 3 to 2 to 3 to 1, and they're more outnumbered, and you're more likely to win with your attack in that situation. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say about reserves. So that pretty much concludes the series for me. If anyone has any questions about the 4 videos in this series, or about ideas that these games raised for you, or just wants to see an extra example game of some kind, either of a defense or an attack or anything, just let me know in the comments section, and I will certainly consider making a further video in the series. I can make a simpler example or a more complicated example, whatever you think would help you to understand this. If you still have some doubts, or if you just want to sort of get it even clearer in your head, or if you have a game where you think reserve attackers or defenders came up and you want me to go over like a game of yours that has that in it, you could send me a PGN, and I might use it. So yeah, hope that was good, and I will be doing another video soon on a different topic. Bye.